My name is Dalton Reeves. I'm 33 years old. My son's kindergarten teacher called me on a Tuesday afternoon to ask, very gently, who Daddy Jason was. I stood in the parking lot of a hardware store with a bag of drywall screws in my hand and no answer for her at all. I told her I didn't know what she meant. She said Eli had drawn a family picture for a class project, for stick figures under a sun, labeled the way 6-year-olds label things, with his own handwriting underneath each one. Mom. Dad. Eli. Maya. And a fifth figure, off to the side, holding his mother's hand, labeled in the same careful crayon print, Daddy Jason. I thought that phone call was the worst thing I'd hear that week. I was wrong. Because 4 days later, an envelope showed up in our mailbox with no return address, no note inside, just 3 photographs, printed at a drugstore kiosk, time-stamped in the corner the way old cameras used to do it automatically. My wife. A man I didn't recognize. A hotel parking lot in a city we didn't live in. But here's what Kayla didn't know yet: by the time she found out what I'd learned, I'd already had 2 weeks to decide exactly what I was going to do about it, and I hadn't said a single word to her about any of it. Somewhere in this story, there's a conversation between me and my mother-in-law that neither of us ever planned on having, and it's not the conversation you'd expect. 9 years earlier, Kayla and I got married in a church outside Tulsa with about 80 people in the pews, and I remember standing at the front of that room thinking I'd never been surer of anything in my life. That certainty wasn't naive. It held up for a long time. We built something real, a house in a decent school district, 2 kids 4 years apart, the kind of ordinary life that looks unremarkable from the outside and feels, from the inside, like the whole point of everything. Kayla worked as an event coordinator for a firm downtown, the kind of job that ran on other people's weddings and galas and corporate launches, which meant her hours were never quite predictable. I worked project management for a construction firm, steady hours, steady paycheck, home most nights by 6. For a long time, that balance worked. She handled the chaos. I handled the routine. Eli came first, then Maya 3 years later, and somewhere in the noise of 2 kids under 7, I think we both stopped noticing the small ways we'd started drifting toward separate corners of the same house. I want to be honest about something, because it matters for what comes later. I am not a man who picks fights. I never have been. Growing up, my parents fought loudly and often, and I decided somewhere around 15 that I never wanted my own house to sound like that. So I didn't push. When something felt off, I told myself it would resolve on its own, the way weather does. Mostly, for years, it did. That habit served me fine right up until the year it didn't. Jason Whitfield started at Kayla's firm the spring Maya turned 2, an event photographer they'd brought on as a contractor, then eventually full-time. She mentioned him the way you mention any new coworker, in passing, over dinner. Jason thinks we should redo the whole vendor list. Jason covered for me when the Hendricks wedding ran long. I had no reason to flinch at any of it. Coworkers had names. Names came up. By that fall, Kayla's work trips had multiplied: conferences in Dallas, a vendor retreat in Kansas City, a certification course that ran 2 full weekends. I noticed the frequency without doing anything about it, the way you notice rain starting without necessarily going to close the windows. She came home from these trips a little more distant each time, a little quicker to check her phone at dinner, a little slower to meet my eyes when I asked how it went. I asked. She always had an answer. The answers were always reasonable enough that pushing further felt like an accusation I didn't have grounds for yet. There was a night in September I still think about, not because anything happened in it, but because of what I chose not to say. Kayla came home from a team dinner, smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't mine, and I was sitting on the couch with Eli half asleep against my shoulder, and she kissed the top of my head on her way past and said something about how tired she was, and I remember the thought arriving clean and complete: that's not our cologne. I let it go. I told myself I was imagining things, that 9 years of marriage made a man suspicious of nothing, that trust was supposed to mean not needing proof. Kayla's mother, Linda, started coming around more that winter, picking up the kids from daycare some afternoons, staying for dinner more often than she used to. I liked Linda. I'd always liked her. What I didn't understand yet was that her increased presence in our house wasn't about helping out. It was about managing something, quietly, from a position close enough to see everything and say nothing. Eli's drawing came home from school in October, tucked into his backpack folder along with a spelling test and a lunch menu, and I nearly missed it entirely, one more piece of paper in the daily avalanche of kindergarten artwork that ended up on our refrigerator without much scrutiny. I looked at it for maybe 4 seconds before Kayla, home early that day for once, took it gently out of my hand and said, "Kids draw weird stuff, don't read into it," and put it in a drawer instead of on the fridge. I let that go too. I filed it, the way I'd been filing things for months, and told myself the pattern would resolve on its own, the way it always had before. It was the teacher's phone call 4 days later that finally cracked something open, not because of what she told me, but because of the question underneath it, the one I couldn't stop turning over for the rest of that afternoon, standing in a hardware store parking lot with drywall screws going warm in the Oklahoma sun. How long had my 6-year-old known something I didn't? I didn't ask Kayla about the phone call that night. I told myself I needed to think first, get my facts straight, not walk in swinging accusations I couldn't back up with anything but a kindergarten teacher's careful tone. That was the story I told myself. The truth, closer to the bone, was that some part of me was terrified of what asking would actually confirm. That's who I am, and I knew it even then. I've spent my whole adult life believing that not pushing was a form of strength, that a man who doesn't raise his voice, doesn't demand answers, doesn't make a scene, is somehow the stronger one in the room. Kayla used to say she loved that about me. "You never make things bigger than they need to be," she told me once, early on, and I took it as a compliment for years before I understood it might have also been something else, a description of exactly how much room I was willing to give her without asking questions. The week after the teacher's call went by almost normally, which is its own kind of strange when you're carrying something that heavy. Kayla came home Tuesday and Wednesday at her usual time, made dinner, helped Eli with his reading homework, put Maya to bed without any indication that anything in her world had shifted. I watched all of it differently now, not with any plan yet, just with a kind of attention I hadn't let myself have in months. Her phone habits hadn't changed, exactly, but I was noticing them for the first time in a long while. Face down on the counter, always. A quick glance and a quicker turn away whenever it lit up during dinner. Thursday night, it buzzed twice in a row while she was helping Maya with a puzzle, and she didn't even look at it, just reached over, flipped it face down harder than the first time, like she was trying to make the sound stop rather than see who it was. I didn't say anything. I noted it. I was becoming, without quite admitting it to myself, a man who kept a running list. Linda came by that Saturday to take the kids to the zoo, which had become a semi-regular arrangement over the past few months, and I found myself watching her too, the way I'd started watching everyone. She was warm with Eli and Maya, easy, affectionate, the same Linda I'd known for 9 years. But when I mentioned, casually, that Eli's teacher had called about his family drawing, something crossed her face too fast to name and gone just as fast. "Kids draw all kinds of things," she said, echoing almost exactly what Kayla had said days earlier, and reached for her purse like the conversation had already ended. I didn't push. I never pushed. But I noticed the matching phrase, and it sat with me longer than I let on. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever caught two people in your life giving you the same rehearsed-sounding answer to the same question, days apart, without either of them knowing the other had said it, you already know the particular kind of cold that settles in your chest when you realize you're not imagining a pattern anymore. I didn't say any of that to Linda. I just watched her drive away with my kids in the back seat, and I stood in the driveway a long time after the car turned the corner. Eli mentioned Jason again that week, unprompted, the way kids do. We were building a Lego set on his bedroom floor, and he said, out of nowhere, "Jason has a boat. He said he'd take us on it sometime." I asked him when he'd met Jason. He shrugged, focused on a Lego piece that wasn't fitting right. "At the park with Mommy. He plays with Maya on the swings." I asked when that had happened. Another shrug. I don't know. A bunch of times. I kept my voice even, asked him what else they did together, and Eli, 6 years old and utterly without guile, said, he buys us ice cream. He said not to tell you, 'cause it's a surprise. I asked what kind of surprise. Eli didn't know. He'd stopped asking that question himself a while ago, the way kids do when an adult gives them a reason that sounds official enough. I sat on his bedroom floor for a long moment after that, a half-built Lego structure between us, and didn't trust my own voice enough to say anything else about it. The credit card statement came the following week, and for the first time, I actually sat with it instead of skimming past the round numbers like I always had. Most of it was ordinary: groceries, gas, Maya's daycare tuition. But there was a hotel charge from 3 weeks earlier, a city 2 hours away, the same weekend Kayla had told me she was at a vendor certification retreat in Kansas City. $211. One night. I didn't say anything about it at dinner that night, or the next. I photographed the statement and put it back exactly where I'd found it, the way you handle something you're not ready to use yet. I called my brother Wade that Sunday, mostly because I needed to hear someone else's voice that wasn't part of any of this. We talked about his fantasy football team, our dad's blood pressure, nothing that mattered. And then, almost without deciding to, I said, would you be able to tell if Kayla was lying to me? Wade went quiet on the other end for a beat too long. Why, is she? I told him I didn't know yet. He didn't push either. We're built the same way, Wade and I, careful men from a careful family, but he said one thing before we hung up that stuck with me for days: you'll know when you're ready to know, Dalton. Question is whether you'll let yourself get there before it's too late to matter. I didn't understand exactly what he meant by that at the time. I understood it a lot better 2 weeks later, the day the envelope showed up in our mailbox with no return address and 3 photographs inside that made every half-formed suspicion I'd been quietly cataloging suddenly, undeniably, real. The envelope had no return address, no note, nothing but 3 photographs printed at a drugstore kiosk, the kind with a date stamp burned into the corner the way they used to be automatic. Kayla. A man I didn't recognize, tall, dark-haired, mid-30s. A hotel parking lot in a city 2 hours from home. The same weekend as the credit card charge. The same weekend as the certification retreat. I stood at the kitchen counter with the mail in my hand for a long time before I moved. I didn't know who'd sent it. That question sat underneath everything for days: a coworker with a grudge, someone at the hotel, a jilted ex of the man in the photo, even, briefly, a paranoid thought that Kayla had sent it to herself somehow, testing me, though I couldn't make that theory hold up under any real weight. I never found out who mailed it. That loose thread stayed loose the whole way through, one of the only things in this story that never got tied off. I photographed the photographs, a strange thing to do, documenting evidence of evidence, and put the originals in a folder in my truck, under the driver's seat, next to registration papers no one would think to look through. The man in the photo, I learned 2 days later, was Jason Whitfield. I found his name easily enough. Kayla's firm had a staff page, and his headshot matched the man in the parking lot closely enough that there wasn't much room for doubt. Event photographer. Started the spring Maya turned 2. The name Eli had already handed me weeks earlier, in Legos and ice cream and a boat that didn't belong to our family. I want to pause here, because this is the part where I almost went chasing the wrong thing entirely, and it's worth admitting that out loud. I became convinced, for the better part of a week, that Linda wasn't just aware of the affair but was actively facilitating it, using the zoo trips and the extra babysitting as cover for Kayla's time with Jason, running interference on purpose, not just staying quiet out of loyalty. I built a whole theory around it, replayed every zoo Saturday in my head looking for gaps in the timeline that would prove it. I was partly right and partly wrong, and the difference mattered more than I expected. Linda hadn't been arranging meetups. What she'd actually been doing, I learned much later, was trying to talk Kayla out of it, badly, inconsistently, the way a mother tries to fix something she doesn't want to admit is broken beyond a conversation. She wasn't covering for the affair. She was covering for her daughter's shame, which isn't the same thing, though from where I stood at the time, it looked identical. Kayla told me herself, much later, what one of those zoo Saturdays had actually looked like on her end. My mom cornered me by the elephant enclosure while the kids were watching the seals, and she just said it, "Kayla, I know what's going on, and I need you to stop before this costs you everything." I remember feeling this flash of relief, almost, like maybe if someone else said it out loud I wouldn't have to carry it by myself anymore. And then right behind the relief came this wall of shame so heavy I could barely look at her. I told her she didn't understand. She said she understood plenty, she'd been married 31 years, she knew exactly what this kind of thing cost a family. I told her to drop it. She did, because that's what she does, she doesn't push either, but I could tell it cost her something to let it go, and I hated myself a little more every time she looked at me different after that. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet, not about the elephant enclosure, not about Linda's warning, not about how close Kayla had come, in that moment, to actually hearing it. The pattern I'd been tracking for weeks kept accumulating in small, specific ways. Kayla started taking calls in the garage, door closed, a habit she'd never had before. She stopped putting her phone on the charger in our bedroom at night, keeping it in her purse instead, purse zipped, purse by her side of the bed like something she needed within reach but out of sight. When I mentioned, lightly, that she seemed tired lately, she said work had been a nightmare, an event gone sideways, a client threatening to sue over a cancellation fee, and the explanation was detailed enough, specific enough, that I almost let it fully satisfy me. Almost. Eli's teacher called again that week, this time about something smaller, a mix-up over pickup authorization, Jason's name accidentally left on a list of approved adults that should never have had it in the first place. Just wanted to double-check that was intentional, she said, careful, the same careful tone from the first call. I told her it wasn't intentional. I asked her to remove it. I didn't ask how it had gotten there in the first place, though the answer wasn't hard to guess. That was the moment the suspicion in me stopped being something I was managing quietly and became something closer to a decision waiting to happen. Not confrontation yet. Something colder and more deliberate than that, the sense that whatever came next needed to be built on more than photographs from an anonymous envelope and a 6-year-old's Lego confessions. I started keeping the folder updated more carefully after that. Dates. Times. The pickup list mix-up, printed and dated. The credit card statement, photographed twice now to be sure. I didn't know yet exactly what I was building toward. I just knew I wasn't ready to walk into a conversation with Kayla and let her talk her way around evidence I could hold in my hands. What I didn't know, what wouldn't become clear for another 2 weeks, was that Kayla had started sensing the shift in me too, the same way I'd been sensing hers for months. And the both of us circling each other in that particular kind of silence, each one convinced the other still didn't know anything, was about to collide with something neither of us had planned for. I found out about the storage unit by accident, the way most of it had come to me. Kayla mentioned it in passing, the way you mention something you don't think is worth explaining. I need to run by the storage place this weekend, drop off some old event decor, and it would have meant nothing at all if I hadn't already known we didn't have a storage unit. We'd never needed one. Our garage held everything we owned that wasn't in the house. I didn't say anything. I just remembered it, the way I'd been remembering everything for weeks now, filed alongside the photographs and the pickup list and the credit card charge that never quite stopped sitting wrong in my chest. I followed her that Saturday. I want to be honest about how that felt, because it didn't feel like something a good man does, sitting 2 cars back in a rented sedan I'd borrowed from Wade specifically so my truck wouldn't be recognized, watching my own wife's taillights through a Tulsa Saturday afternoon like I was someone in a different kind of story than the one I'd thought I was living. She drove past the daycare, past the grocery store, out toward the edge of town to a self-storage facility I'd never once heard her mention in 9 years of marriage. She wasn't alone. Jason's car was already in the lot. I sat 2 rows back, engine off, and watched them unlock a unit together, not decor, not anything I could see clearly from that distance, just 2 people moving with the kind of ease that comes from repetition, from having done this exact thing enough times that it wasn't nervous anymore. They were inside for 11 minutes. I know because I counted. When they came back out, Jason's hand rested on the small of her back for a moment before he caught himself and pulled it away, glancing around the lot first, the way people do when they've mostly stopped being careful but some old instinct still fires late. I didn't go in. I didn't confront either of them. I drove home before Kayla did, my hands steady on the wheel in a way that felt less like calm and more like something shutting down to protect itself. That storage unit connected everything. The Kansas City trip. The hotel charge. The pickup list. Whatever was in that unit, and I'd find out eventually, though not that day, it was the physical proof that this wasn't an emotional entanglement that had gotten out of hand once or twice. This was infrastructure. This was something built to last. Kayla came home that evening and told me she dropped off old centerpieces at storage, mentioned it so casually I almost admired the performance. I said that was smart, decluttering the garage. I meant nothing by my voice at all. I'd gotten good at that, by then, good in a way that scared me a little, if I let myself think about it too long. Linda called me 2 days later. Not Kayla. Me. She said she needed to talk, and her voice had a shake in it I'd never heard from her before, not once in 9 years. She told me she tried to talk Kayla out of it months ago, at the zoo, by the elephants, and that Kayla hadn't listened, and that she'd been carrying the weight of knowing and staying quiet ever since, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep doing it without it costing her something with her grandkids too. Why now, I said. Not really a question. Because I saw the storage unit receipt in her purse when I was watching the kids Thursday. Dalton, it's not decorations. She's been building a life out there. Things for an apartment. I think she's closer to leaving than either of us wants to believe. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. The storage unit wasn't a hiding place for an affair anymore. It was a staging ground for an exit, one she hadn't told me she was planning, one that would have left me finding out the same way I'd found out everything else, after the fact, through someone else's slip. That was the moment the story stopped being only about Jason. I didn't tell Kayla that Linda had called. I filed it, the same as everything else, and I understood, driving home from the grocery store that night with a folder in my truck that had grown thick enough to need a rubber band around it, that whatever happened next couldn't wait for me to feel fully ready. Readiness wasn't coming. I'd been waiting for it for 2 months and it hadn't arrived. Kayla told me, much later, what the storage unit had actually meant to her by that point. I told myself at first it was just somewhere to keep Jason's stuff separate from my real life, like if it stayed in a 10x10 unit on the edge of town it wasn't really touching anything that mattered. But somewhere in there I started bringing things I'd need if I actually left, dishes my mom gave me that I didn't want Dalton to have, photos from before the wedding, things that were just mine. I told myself I was keeping options open. I know now that's not what it was. I was already planning my way out and hadn't found the nerve to say so out loud, to anyone, including myself. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet, not the dishes, not the photographs, not how far along her own quiet exit had actually gotten while I'd been building my own case in a folder under my truck seat. I came close to confronting her that Sunday, actually. She was making pancakes for the kids, Maya on her hip, flour on the counter, and for one full second I almost said all of it right there in the kitchen, the storage unit, Jason, Linda's call, the photographs from the envelope I still didn't know the source of. I stood in the doorway with the words already forming. I didn't say them. Eli ran in asking for extra syrup, and the moment passed, and I told myself later that I'd wanted the kids somewhere else first, that this wasn't a conversation for a Sunday morning kitchen. That was true. It also wasn't the whole reason, and I knew it even as I let the moment go. By Monday, I'd made an appointment with a lawyer, not to file anything yet, just to understand what I was looking at, what Oklahoma law said about a marriage like the one I was apparently still standing inside of. I sat in that lawyer's office that afternoon with the folder open on the desk between us, and she looked through it for a long time before she said the thing that finally made all of this feel real in a way nothing else had yet: you have more than enough here. The question isn't whether you can prove it. The question is when you're ready to use it. I didn't plan the timing. It happened because Eli's school called again, a third time, this one about a permission slip Kayla had signed listing Jason as an emergency contact, and something about that phone call, so small compared to everything else in the folder, was the thing that finally moved me. I picked Eli and Maya up early, dropped them at Wade's, and was sitting at our kitchen table when Kayla got home that evening. She saw the folder before she saw my face. It was sitting closed on the table, the rubber band still around it, next to the lawyer's card. What is that? Sit down. Dalton, what's going on? Is something wrong with the kids? They're at Wade's. They're fine. I pushed the folder an inch toward her. Sit down. She sat. Her hand went to the folder and stopped before touching it, like some part of her already knew what opening it would cost. I know about Jason, I said. I know about the storage unit. I know your mother tried to talk you out of it in the spring and you told her to drop it. Her face went through something fast, shock first, then a kind of scrambling, then a flatness settling over the scrambling like a lid coming down. It's not what you think. Open it. She opened it. Photographs first, then the credit card statement, then a printout of the storage facility's rental agreement. I'd gotten a copy of that Monday, her name and Jason's both on it, 6 months old. This doesn't prove. Kayla. I said her name once, and something in my voice made her stop. Our son has been telling me about Daddy Jason's boat for a month. His teacher called about a permission slip with Jason's name on it as an emergency contact. I'm not asking you to explain a photograph anymore. I'm asking you to tell me the truth. She sat with that, jaw tight, hands flat on the table the way people brace themselves. It's complicated. It's not just. How long? Dalton. How long, Kayla? Her composure cracked there, faster than I expected, faster than the folder alone had managed. 8 months. Since the spring. I didn't say anything. I let the silence do what it had been doing for weeks, sitting there, heavy, until she filled it herself. You want to know how it started, so I'll tell you. Her voice had dropped, steadier now in a way that felt less like control and more like exhaustion finally winning. It was after the Hendricks wedding ran long, back in March. Jason stayed to help me break down the venue at midnight, and we were both exhausted and laughing about something stupid, and I remember standing in that empty ballroom thinking, nobody's looked at me like this in years. Not badly. Just like I was still someone, not just somebody's mom, somebody's wife who ran the schedule. He said something about my laugh. I told myself that was harmless. It wasn't harmless. It just didn't feel like the first real lie yet. She stopped. Started again, slower. After that it kept happening in pieces I could talk myself past. A drink after a shared event. A hotel room split for a conference that didn't need 2 rooms. Every single time I told myself it was the last time, and I meant it when I said it, and then a week would pass and there'd be a reason. I got very good at reasons. Her voice caught. I couldn't look at Eli's drawing some days. There's one on the fridge with all of us under a sun, and I'd stand there making his lunch and just, not look at it, because I knew what I'd let him draw into that picture without ever explaining it to him. The storage unit, I said. Tell me about that. She flinched. I started keeping things there in the summer. Dishes from my mom. Photos. Things I didn't want to lose if, she stopped herself, started over. I told myself I was keeping options open. I wasn't. I was already planning to leave and hadn't found a way to say it. To you. To myself. Did you ever try to stop? Once, really. My mom found out in the spring, cornered me at the zoo, told me to stop before it cost me everything. I told her to drop it. I've hated myself for that more than almost anything else in this whole mess, that she tried, and I shut her down, and she carried it alone after that because I asked her to. I sat back. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator humming, Eli's drawing not on the fridge anymore, still in whatever drawer it had ended up in months ago. "Does he know I know?" I asked. "No." "Good." I stood up. "You're going to call your mother tonight and thank her for trying, because she's the only person in this whole thing who actually tried to stop it before it got here. And you're not staying in this house tonight. Dalton, please, can we just..." "I've been quiet for 2 months, Kayla. I've been quiet for probably longer than that if I'm honest about it. I'm done being quiet." I picked up the folder, the lawyer's card visible on top. "I'm not deciding anything final tonight. But I'm not sitting at this table pretending we're still figuring out what happened. I already know what happened. I've known for a while. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud." She looked at the folder, then at me, then toward the hallway where Eli's and Maya's rooms sat empty for the night, and something in her face told me she understood, finally, that whatever version of this conversation she'd been dreading for months, the real one had turned out to be quieter and more final than anything she'd braced for. She picked up her keys. She didn't say anything else on her way out. I heard her car start in the driveway, and I sat back down at the table, the folder still open in front of me, and didn't move for a long time after the sound of her engine faded down the street. The divorce took 5 months, longer than it should have because Kayla's lawyer tried, early on, to fight the custody terms my attorney proposed. It didn't hold up. Oklahoma courts pay attention to things like a storage unit rental agreement with another man's name on it and a permission slip listing him as an emergency contact for children who weren't his. I got the house. I got primary custody of Eli and Maya, with Kayla getting alternating weekends and Wednesday dinners. She kept her car, her savings, and whatever was in that storage unit, which she cleared out herself, alone, on a Tuesday I wasn't home for. Jason didn't survive the fallout either, though not because of anything I did. Once the affair became public inside a firm as small as Kayla's, HR opened an inquiry into a supervisor-adjacent relationship that violated company policy, and he was let go within a month. I heard, through the kind of channel these things always travel, that he moved to Dallas for a smaller job and stopped returning Kayla's calls sometime around Christmas. Whatever they'd built needed secrecy to survive. Once the storage unit was empty and the secret was gone, there wasn't much left underneath it. Linda called me in January, her voice steadier than it had been on that phone call in the fall. She apologized again for not pushing harder in the spring. I told her there was nothing left to apologize for. She tried, in the only way she knew how, and I understood now exactly how heavy that kind of quiet effort gets when nobody around you is ready to hear it. I want to say something plainly here, because it matters more than anything dressed up. I spent most of my marriage believing that not pushing, not confronting, not making things bigger than they needed to be, was some kind of virtue. I know now it was avoidance wearing a calmer face. I don't blame myself for what Kayla did. But I've stopped pretending my silence in the months I already suspected something was neutral. It wasn't. It just gave the truth more time to build a storage unit's worth of infrastructure before I finally said a word about any of it. Eli is 7 now. He still draws family pictures sometimes, different ones, him, me, Maya, and a small dog we adopted in March that he's convinced was his idea. Kayla shows up in a separate drawing now, on a different page, which his school counselor tells me is a healthy way for a kid his age to hold 2 households in his head without either one collapsing the other. Kayla and I are civil at handoffs. She's never once tried to make me the villain of this to the kids, which is more than I expected some days and exactly what I hoped for on others. Last week I stood at the kitchen counter watching Eli finish a school project at the same table where I once slid a folder across to his mother and asked her to tell me the truth. He held up his poster board, some assignment about his family, 3 figures under a sun this time, him, me, Maya, with a small dog drawn in the corner he'd clearly added as an afterthought because he loved it more than the assignment required. I looked at that poster board and understood I was looking at my son's whole world, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't have a hole cut out of the middle of it. Something in me finally let go, standing right there at the counter, without announcing it to anyone, including myself. That's my story. A drawing labeled Daddy Jason, an envelope with no return address, a storage unit that held more of my marriage's ending than our house ever did. I've had some time to sit with all of it since, and a few things have stayed with me longer than I expected. There's the drawing. It taught me that kids see everything, whether we think we're hiding it well or not, and that the cost of adult silence often lands hardest on the smallest people in the house. There's also what I learned from waiting so long to open that folder. Staying quiet to keep the peace isn't the same as actually protecting your family, it's just protecting yourself from a conversation you're afraid to have. And underneath both of those, I think, is the harder one, that loving someone completely doesn't mean you stop paying attention to them, and for years I confused those two things like they were the same skill. I still think about that permission slip sometimes, how something so small and administrative ended up being the detail that finally moved me. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If any part of it found something familiar in your own life, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next story.